At 9:35 on the morning of April 18, 1943, 16 American fighters reached the coast of Bougainville. For more than 2 hours they had flown over open Pacific water. They had stayed so low that ocean spray seemed almost close enough to touch. Their radios had remained silent. Their route had deliberately taken them away from the obvious chain of islands, because a single Japanese observer, one radar contact, or one warning transmitted from an isolated outpost could ruin everything. The pilots were not searching for an enemy formation. They were waiting for an appointment. Somewhere ahead of them, according to American calculations, 2 Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bombers should be approaching Bougainville. 60 fighters should be protecting them, and inside one of those bombers should be a man the United States had wanted to find since December 7, 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Combined Fleet, the officer most closely associated with the plan that had sent Japanese carrier aircraft over Pearl Harbor. The Americans had never seen his bomber take off. No reconnaissance aircraft was following it. No American submarine had spotted it. There was no tracking beacon aboard the aircraft. 4 days earlier, however, American intelligence had intercepted a Japanese naval message. The message contained Yamamoto's travel itinerary, his route, his aircraft arrangements, his escort, and enough timing information to predict where he would be. From that intercepted message, American planners had worked backward. They calculated distance, they calculated speed, they calculated winds, they calculated fuel. They calculated the exact point where Yamamoto's aircraft and American fighters might occupy the same patch of sky. There was almost no margin for error. If the Americans arrived several minutes too early, they might have to circle and expose themselves. If they arrived several minutes late, Yamamoto could already be landing. And after flying hundreds of miles to reach him, the P-38s would not have enough fuel to search Bougainville indefinitely. The entire mission depended upon one assumption: Yamamoto would follow his schedule. Then the American pilots looked ahead. Aircraft, 2 twin-engine bombers. Above and behind them, 6 Japanese Zeros. The intercepted message had been right. The mathematics had been right. And the man who had helped bring surprise to Pearl Harbor was now flying into an ambush built from his own Navy's secret communications. The P-38 pilots released their external fuel tanks. Engines roared. The formation Japanese fighters turned toward them. The 2 bombers dived toward the jungle. Within minutes, Yamamoto would be dead. But the burst of gunfire that killed him was only the final step. The real weapon had been assembled thousands of miles away, in intercept stations, intelligence rooms, planning offices, workshops, and on navigation charts. Operation Vengeance was not simply a fighter mission. It was one of the most extraordinary long-range interceptions of the Pacific War. And before the P-38 could hunt down the admiral who planned Pearl Harbor, the Americans first had to solve a problem that looked almost impossible. They had to know where one man would be before he got there. To understand why the United States accepted the risk, it is necessary to understand who was sitting inside that Japanese bomber. Isoroku Yamamoto was not simply a senior officer. By 1943, he was one of the most famous military figures in Japan. As Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, he occupied a position at the center of Japanese naval strategy. He had studied and served in the United States. He understood American industry. He had seen American automobile factories, oil production, and economic scale. That experience had made him deeply skeptical of a prolonged war against the United States. Japan could win battles. It could seize territory. It could destroy ships. But if the war became a contest of replacement, ships for ships, aircraft for aircraft, trained crews for trained crews. American industrial power threatened to become overwhelming. Yet once Japan's political leadership moved toward war, Yamamoto insisted that the opening blow had to be extraordinary. He did not want the American Pacific Fleet left intact at Pearl Harbor, while Japan moved south into Southeast Asia. He wanted the fleet attacked before it could interfere. That idea required Japan to do something extremely dangerous: send a powerful carrier force thousands of miles across the North Pacific, approach Hawaii without being detected, launch hundreds of aircraft, strike the Pacific Fleet at anchor, then escape before American forces could respond. The operation demanded secrecy on an enormous scale. Japanese crews trained for months. Torpedoes were modified for Pearl Harbor's shallow water. Pilots practiced attacks against replicas of the harbor. The carrier strike force moved east under strict communications discipline. And on the morning of December 7, 1941, the plan worked tactically. Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu. American battleships were caught at anchor. Arizona exploded. Oklahoma capsized. West Virginia sank at her berth. California settled into the harbor. Aircraft were destroyed across American airfields. More than 2,400 Americans died. For many Americans, Yamamoto became the human face behind the attack. But Pearl Harbor also contained the contradiction that would eventually consume Japan's strategy. The raid damaged the Pacific Fleet. It did not eliminate American power. The U.S. aircraft carriers were not present. Submarines survived. Repair facilities survived. Fuel infrastructure largely survived. And the attack transformed an uncertain political situation into a national war effort. Yamamoto had warned about American industrial power. Now Pearl Harbor gave that industrial power a reason to mobilize completely. Within 6 months, the balance was already beginning to change. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, those ships had formed the heart of the carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor. And intelligence had played a crucial role. American codebreakers had extracted enough information from Japanese communications to determine that Midway was the objective. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned American carriers accordingly. The Japanese had expected to create an ambush. Instead, they entered one. Yamamoto survived Midway. He remained commander of the combined fleet. But by early 1943, the Pacific War no longer resembled the war Japan had begun. Guadalcanal had been lost. Japanese naval aviation had paid heavily for months of combat. Experienced pilots could not be replaced quickly. American aircraft production was accelerating. New ships were arriving. And the Allied advance was pushing north. Yamamoto was still dangerous, still respected, still influential. But he was now commanding a navy under growing pressure. That was the man whose itinerary suddenly appeared inside an American intelligence system in April 1943. The Pacific War was fought in 2 different worlds. The first was visible. Battleships fired. Aircraft bombed airfields. Marines crossed beaches. Destroyers launched torpedoes. Carriers burned. Men fought through jungle. The Second War was almost invisible. It happened behind locked doors. Radio operators listened to signals traveling through the atmosphere. Intercept stations copied groups of numbers. Cryptanalysts covered paper with possible solutions. Translators reconstructed fragments. Traffic analysts studied call signs and transmission patterns. Commanders received information without always being told exactly how it had been obtained. Japan's naval communications used sophisticated code systems generally known to the Americans under the JN-25 designation. Breaking them was not like discovering a password and suddenly reading everything. Codebooks changed. Additive systems complicated the messages. Groups of numbers represented words, phrases, places, units, and commands. Even after enough of the system had been reconstructed, many messages remained partial or uncertain. Every fragment had to be compared against other fragments. But partial information could still be strategically decisive. Before Midway, American intelligence used Japanese communications to help establish that the target designated by the Japanese as AF was Midway. The advantage did not mean America knew everything. It meant commanders sometimes knew the one thing that mattered most: where the enemy intended to go. In April 1943, the intelligence system produced something even more specific. Not the movement of a fleet, not the objective of an invasion. The movement of one man. On April 14, American radio interception stations copied a Japanese naval message. It was forwarded for exploitation, including to Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, at Pearl Harbor. The cryptologic effort revealed a detailed itinerary connected to Yamamoto's inspection trip. The information was extraordinary because of its precision. Yamamoto would travel through the northern Solomon Islands. His flight arrangements were specified. The escort was specified. Timing was included. The message had probably been transmitted because Japanese commanders needed to prepare for the Admiral's visit. Local units needed to know when he would arrive. Personnel needed to be ready. Aircraft had to be organized. The routine requirements of command created the vulnerability. The Japanese naval system had transmitted the whereabouts of its most important operational commander. And American codebreakers were listening. When the recovered information reached senior American intelligence officers, the opportunity was obvious. So was the danger. A Japanese admiral could be replaced. An intelligence advantage might be irreplaceable. If American fighters suddenly appeared at exactly the right time, hundreds of miles from their normal operating area, Japanese officers could ask an uncomfortable question. How did they know? Suppose Japan concluded that the itinerary had been compromised. The Japanese Navy could change its code systems. Communications procedures could become stricter. Call signs could change. Schedules might no longer be transmitted in detail. A successful operation against Yamamoto might therefore destroy an intelligence source capable of revealing future fleet movements involving thousands of men and dozens of ships. This was the hidden cost of Operation Vengeance. The Americans had information so valuable that acting on it could reveal that they possessed it. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his intelligence staff had to weigh the value of Yamamoto against the value of continued access to Japanese communications. The calculation favored action. Yamamoto was not simply a symbolic target. He possessed experience, authority, prestige, and knowledge of Japanese naval strategy that could not be reproduced merely by promoting another officer. The Americans decided the opportunity was worth the risk. Orders moved into Admiral William Halsey's South Pacific Command. The operation would be planned. But secrecy had to be preserved. The pilots eventually needed a cover explanation. The intelligence could not be described casually as intercepted Japanese naval communications. Stories involving coast watchers and other intelligence sources helped obscure the actual origin. Even within the American force, information was compartmented. The fewer people who understood exactly how Yamamoto had been located, the safer the code-breaking advantage remained. Now came the next question. American intelligence could predict where Yamamoto was going, but could any American fighter reach him? Look at a map of the Solomon Islands, and the difficulty becomes obvious. The American fighter base around Guadalcanal was hundreds of miles from the Bougainville area. The interception point was roughly 435 miles away. And that was only part of the problem. A direct flight was dangerous. The P-38s would have to pass near Japanese-held islands. Observers could report them. Japanese radar could detect them. Aircraft could intercept them. A formation of American fighters flying north in daylight might reveal the entire mission before Yamamoto left his protected airspace. The Americans therefore needed an indirect approach over the ocean. That made the distance longer. Then the fighters had to reach the interception area with enough fuel remaining to climb. Fight, possibly chase Japanese aircraft, and fly all the way home. The Navy's F-4F Wildcat did not have the required mission radius. The available F-4U Corsairs could not meet the complete requirement either. There was one fighter in the theater with the range necessary to attempt it, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It was unlike almost anything else in the sky. 2 long engine booms, a central cockpit nacelle, twin tails connected by a horizontal stabilizer, 2 Allison engines, and concentrated in the nose 4 .50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. The Lightning had been designed as a high-performance interceptor. Its twin engines gave it power and offered some reassurance on long overwater flights. Its distinctive layout left the nose free for heavy armament. Unlike wing-mounted weapons that had to be angled so their bullets converged at a chosen distance, the P-38's guns fired almost directly along the pilot's line of sight. When the nose pointed at a target, an intense concentration of fire could arrive there. That would matter later. But before the guns mattered, the fuel tanks mattered. The standard range still left little margin for a mission this extreme. External drop tanks would have to transform the fighter into a long-distance hunter. Fuel became the central engineering problem. A fighter pilot normally wanted the lightest, most responsive aircraft possible when entering combat. Operation Vengeance required the opposite during the approach. The Lightnings would take off heavily loaded with fuel and external tanks, cruise for hours, then discard the tanks immediately before combat. Every gallon had to be calculated. Too little, and the fighters would never reach Yamamoto. Too much weight or drag, and performance suffered. A leak, mechanical failure, navigational error, or unexpected dogfight could leave a pilot with hundreds of miles of ocean between himself and home. No rescue force could guarantee finding him. The P-38 did not make the mission easy. It merely made the mission possible. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force describes the eventual flight as a 435-mile, wave-hugging interception executed with almost split-second timing. Less than a day's final planning would turn that theoretical range into a real operation. The mission now required someone capable of converting intelligence into aviation mathematics. That responsibility fell to Major John W. Mitchell. Mitchell commanded the 339th Fighter Squadron. The problem he received was unlike an ordinary fighter assignment. Normally, fighters could patrol an area. They could escort bombers. They could be vectored toward enemy aircraft. Operation Vengeance offered almost none of those luxuries. The Japanese formation would be moving. The Americans could not linger near Bougainville waiting for it. They could not radio constantly for corrections. They could not fly a wide search pattern. They could not depend on ground radar guiding them throughout the mission. Mitchell had to create an interception using dead reckoning. Start here. Fly this heading. For this length of time. At this speed. Correct for wind. Change course here. Reach this point at this minute. Then climb. It was navigation reduced to discipline. A mistake of only a few degrees, held for hundreds of miles, could produce a huge error at the end. A small wind miscalculation could move the formation miles away from the intended position. And the Pacific provided almost nothing to help. For much of the outbound route, the pilots would see water in every direction. There would be no road intersection beneath them, no railway, no familiar mountain, no city, no radio beacon leading directly to the target. Mitchell was effectively navigating an air formation like a naval task group. The intercepted itinerary supplied the Japanese side of the equation. The expected speed of Yamamoto's bombers, their route, their arrival schedule. Mitchell supplied the American side. P-38 cruising speed, fuel consumption, expected wind, distance between course changes, time required for the final climb. The goal was not to search for Yamamoto. The goal was to occupy the same location as Yamamoto at the same instant. That distinction was everything. The eventual interception would look miraculous. It was actually mathematics. The planned force contained 18 P-38 Lightnings drawn from units operating in the Solomons. 2 aircraft would function as spares. 4 were assigned to the attack element, the group whose primary job was to get to the Japanese bombers. The rest would provide top cover and deal with the Zero escorts, or any additional Japanese fighters arriving from nearby bases. This division reflected the real threat. Yamamoto's G4M was not expected to fly alone. The intercepted message indicated fighter protection, and Bougainville was deep inside Japanese-controlled airspace. The Americans could not assume that the 6 escorting Zeros would be the only enemy fighters encountered. Major Mitchell would lead the overall mission. Captain Thomas Landfire was assigned an important position in the attack section. Rex Barber was among the men who would go directly after the bombers. Besby Holmes and Raymond Hine were also part of the attack group. Every pilot understood the mission could become a fuel emergency, even if no Japanese fighter fired a shot. Ground crews prepared the aircraft. External tanks were installed. Engines were checked. Fuel lines mattered as much as machine guns. Navigation was reviewed. Radio silence was emphasized. The pilots received information about a high-value Japanese passenger. Not every detail of the code-breaking process was explained. The intelligence source was too important. The target had been located. Now the men who would fly the mission needed to know only enough to reach him and attack. On April 18, 1943, the P-38s began taking off from Guadalcanal. Almost immediately, the plan began losing aircraft. 2 Lightnings encountered problems and could not continue normally with the strike. The spare aircraft filled the gaps. 16 fighters remained. There would be no replacement after that. From here forward, every aircraft lost to mechanical trouble reduced the force that would meet Yamamoto. The Lightnings turned away from Guadalcanal. Then the island began disappearing behind them. Ahead, hundreds of miles of empty Pacific. The formation descended. Low altitude served several purposes. It made visual detection more difficult. It reduced the range at which Japanese radar might detect them. And it kept the P-38s beneath some of the normal air traffic and observation patterns around Japanese bases. But low-level flight carried its own dangers. The Pacific was not a flat painted surface. Waves rose. Spray moved. Clouds and weather systems complicated navigation. At extremely low altitude, a pilot had almost no room to recover from a lapse of attention. The sea filled the windscreen. The P-38s flew in disciplined formation. Radio silence continued. For more than 2 hours. There was very little for the pilots to do except maintain position, monitor instruments, watch fuel, and trust Mitchell's headings. That psychological pressure is difficult to reproduce. They had been told that one of the most important Japanese officers in the Pacific would be somewhere ahead. But for hour after hour there was no enemy. Only engines. Ocean, compass, clock, fuel gauges. The mission depended on restraint. A pilot could not waste fuel weaving unnecessarily. He could not climb to improve visibility. He could not break radio silence to ask repeated questions. The flight had to remain predictable, because Mitchell's timing assumed predictable performance. Every minute over water consumed the resource that could not be recovered. Fuel, the fighters continued north. The Solomon Islands lay off their direct path because the Americans were deliberately avoiding the route an enemy might expect them to use. At intervals, Mitchell changed heading according to the prepared navigation plan. There was no indication yet that Yamamoto had altered his itinerary. No indication the Japanese had discovered the operation. No indication that the intelligence had been wrong, but the pilots would not know until the final minutes. After more than 2 hours of flying, Bougainville approached. The formation began turning toward the interception point. The moment of truth was close. If the Japanese aircraft were not there, nearly everything the Americans had done would become useless. They could not search forever. They could not attack Yamamoto's airfield after landing and expect to survive the defenses. They had come to intercept an aircraft in flight. It either appeared or the mission failed. Then silhouettes appeared ahead. While the American P-38s were crossing the ocean, Yamamoto was beginning his own day. He was conducting an inspection and morale-building trip through the Japanese positions in the northern Solomons. Japan had recently carried out Operation First Go, a major aerial offensive intended to strike Allied forces in the region. Japanese pilots had reported impressive results. As happened repeatedly during the Pacific War, those reports significantly overstated the damage actually inflicted. Senior commanders received a picture of success larger than reality. Yamamoto intended to visit units associated with the fighting. His presence mattered. A commander-in-chief appearing personally at forward bases could encourage exhausted aircrews. It demonstrated confidence. It rewarded performance. It showed that the highest naval leadership understood what frontline men were doing. The visit also created a security nightmare. Senior commanders generate schedules. Schedules generate radio messages. Aircraft require coordination. Escorts have to rendezvous. Airfields need warning. Staff officers need to know arrival times. Yamamoto was known for punctuality. In ordinary military administration, punctuality is an advantage. On April 18, it turned him into a predictable moving target. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers carried the party. Yamamoto flew in the lead bomber. The second carried his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, and additional personnel. 6 Zero fighters formed the escort. The G4M was one of the most important Japanese land-based naval bombers of the war. It possessed exceptional range. That range had been achieved partly by emphasizing fuel capacity and lightweight construction. Those design choices created vulnerabilities. Compared with many American aircraft, early Japanese bombers offered less protection around crew and fuel systems. When attacked by heavy American fighter armament, a G4M could be dangerously susceptible to fire, yet none of that mattered if enemy fighters could not reach it. Normally, a senior Japanese officer traveling near Bougainville could assume that hundreds of miles of distance from Guadalcanal provided a substantial layer of safety. No normal American fighter patrol should simply appear at precisely the right moment. That assumption was correct, unless the Americans already knew his timetable. The Japanese formation approached Bougainville at roughly 6,500 feet. The Zero escorts occupied positions above and behind the bombers. The flight was nearing its destination. Then the Japanese pilots saw something below. Twin-boom aircraft. P-38 Lightnings. For the Japanese escort pilots, their appearance must have been startling. This was not the usual range at which they expected American fighters to appear from Guadalcanal. The Americans had come hundreds of miles specifically for this formation. The Zeros began reacting. The P-38 attack element released its external fuel tanks and accelerated. The bombers descended rapidly toward the jungle. Low altitude offered them a chance to escape. If they could get close to the trees, the Americans would have less maneuvering room beneath them. The Zeros could force the P-38s away. Japanese bases were nearby. Time favored the defenders. But the American attack plan immediately suffered another problem. One of the kill-flight Lightnings could not properly release a fuel tank. That aircraft and its wingman were temporarily pulled away from the ideal attack position. Instead of 4 P-38s driving directly toward the bombers, the initial attack effectively depended on 2. Lanfear, Barber, the Zero escort, came down. Lanfear maneuvered toward the fighter threat. Barber continued toward the bombers. The neat formation, built over hundreds of miles, instantly dissolved into combat. That is the difference between planning and battle. The navigation could be perfect, the intelligence could be perfect, the timing could be perfect. But once the enemy reacted, every pilot operated inside seconds. The G4Ms dropped toward the green jungle canopy. Barber pushed the P-38 after them. He now faced the moment for which the entire mission had been designed. One of the 2 bombers ahead contained Yamamoto. Nobody in the cockpit of Barber's fighter could know with certainty which one. There was no identifying flag large enough to read. No label. No special formation visible at combat speed. There were simply 2 Japanese bombers trying to escape. Barber selected the lead aircraft and closed. The P-38's weapons were concentrated in the center of the aircraft. 4 heavy machine guns. 1 20mm cannon. There were practical advantages to this layout. Many fighters carried guns in their wings. Because the guns were separated from the pilot's line of sight, their barrels were usually adjusted, so the streams of bullets converged at a chosen distance ahead. Too close or too far from that convergence point, and the pattern spread differently. The P-38 avoided much of that problem. Its guns sat in the nose. The pilot aimed the aircraft. The weapons delivered concentrated fire straight ahead. Against a large bomber, that was devastating. Barber positioned himself behind Yamamoto's G4M. The bomber was descending near the jungle. There was little time. A Zero could arrive behind Barber. The G4M's defensive gunners could fire. The bomber could disappear behind terrain or reach an airfield. Barber brought the P-38's nose onto the target. Then he fired. Machine gun bullets and 20mm cannon shells streamed toward the Japanese aircraft. The G4M took hits. Damage appeared. Barber continued the attack. The bomber began trailing smoke. Its descent became uncontrollable. Ahead was jungle. The aircraft vanished into the trees. A column of smoke rose. Inside that wreck was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The entire engagement had taken seconds. American codebreakers had spent hours reconstructing the message. Senior commanders had debated the consequences. Planners had worked through maps and fuel calculations. Ground crews had prepared 18 aircraft. 16 had crossed hundreds of miles of ocean. All of it converged into a short burst of gunfire from 1 P-38. But the mission was not finished. There was still a second bomber. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki was aboard the second G4M. From his aircraft, the destruction of the lead bomber unfolded with brutal speed. One moment Yamamoto's aircraft was ahead, the next it was descending. Smoke appeared. Then it disappeared into the jungle. Ugaki understood what the lead aircraft carried. There was no uncertainty for him about the significance of what he had seen. The commander-in-chief's aircraft was gone. But Ugaki had no time to process it. His own bomber was now under attack. American fighters turned toward the second G4M. Holmes and Hine re-entered the action. Barber also became involved in the pursuit. The second bomber tried to escape toward the coast. P-38 fire struck it. The aircraft descended. It hit the water violently. Unlike Yamamoto, Ugaki survived. Only a small number of those aboard the second bomber lived through the crash. Ugaki's survival became historically important because it preserved a Japanese eyewitness to the destruction of the commander-in-chief's aircraft. The 6-0 escorts had been unable to prevent the central result. The Americans had reached the two bombers. Both had been destroyed. Japanese accounts did not support some American claims of Zero fighters being shot down during the engagement, another issue that would later complicate the victory credit controversy. But those details belonged to the future. At this moment, the American pilots had a more immediate problem. They were still deep inside Japanese airspace. They had spent fuel fighting. One of their own aircraft would not return, and Guadalcanal was hundreds of miles away. The attack lasted minutes. The journey home took hours. This is the part easily lost when Operation Vengeance is compressed into a few sentences. A P-38 shoots down Yamamoto. Mission accomplished. But after the shooting ended, the pilots remained in an extraordinarily dangerous position. Japanese fighter bases were nearby. Their surprise had been used. The P-38s had no reason to remain. They turned south. Fuel calculations that had looked theoretical in the briefing now became personal. Every pilot watched his gauges. Combat burns fuel quickly. Hard climbs demand power. High-speed maneuvering consumes the reserve built painstakingly during the low-level outbound flight. An aircraft damaged in combat may consume fuel faster or lose it entirely. And beneath them was the Pacific. If an engine failed, the P-38 had a second engine. That was reassuring. But not infinitely reassuring. A damaged Lightning hundreds of miles from Henderson Field remained in serious trouble. Most of the mission force eventually made it home. One pilot did not. Lieutenant Raymond Hine disappeared. The exact circumstances of his loss were never resolved with certainty. He became the American fatality associated with the mission. Rex Barber's aircraft returned heavily damaged. The National WWII Museum records the extraordinary figure of 104 holes in his P-38. Whether every hole was produced during the same few minutes of combat matters less than what the condition of the fighter communicated. This had not been an execution without opposition. The Zeros had reacted. Japanese guns had fired. American pilots had taken risks at the extreme edge of their fighters' operating radius. 15 of the 16 P-38s involved in the final flight came back. Yamamoto did not. The following day, Japanese personnel reached the wreckage of Yamamoto's aircraft in the Bougainville jungle. The scene confirmed what Ugaki already feared. Everyone aboard Yamamoto's bomber was dead. The commander-in-chief's body was recovered from the wreck area. Japanese accounts described him as having remained associated with his seat after the crash. Medical examination found gunshot wounds and concluded that Yamamoto had probably died before the aircraft struck the jungle. The distinction mattered little strategically. The most important operational commander in the Japanese Navy was gone. Tokyo did not announce his death immediately. For more than a month, the information remained hidden from the Japanese public. That secrecy reveals something about Yamamoto's importance. His death was not merely another casualty report. Japanese leaders understood the potential effect on morale. On May 21, 1943, the death was finally announced. Japan mourned. A state funeral followed. The naval officer connected so closely with the victories of the opening months of the Pacific War had died at a moment when those victories were already being reversed. But the Americans faced their own secrecy problem. They desperately wanted the Japanese to believe the interception had been luck. Because if Tokyo understood the truth, that a coded naval itinerary had led American P-38s directly to Yamamoto, the consequences could extend far beyond one dead admiral. The most valuable weapon used in Operation Vengeance did not have wings. It did not fire bullets. It sat inside the intelligence system. American access to Japanese naval communications had already influenced Midway. It could influence future operations. Losing that access might cost American ships and lives. After the mission, secrecy therefore remained essential. The pilots were not supposed to announce publicly that Yamamoto's exact itinerary had been obtained from Japanese coded traffic. A cover explanation involving coast watchers provided a safer story. Coast watchers were real. They operated throughout the islands. They reported Japanese aircraft, ships, and troop movements. If Japan believed a coast watcher had seen Yamamoto's aircraft, or learned of the trip through local observation, it would not necessarily indicate that JN-25 had been penetrated. The problem was human nature. Operation Vengeance was the kind of mission people wanted to talk about. American pilots had flown farther than most fighter intercept missions ever attempted at that point. They had killed the Japanese Combined Fleet commander. Pearl Harbor gave the story enormous emotional power. Claims began emerging. Details circulated. The more specific those details became, the harder it was to protect the intelligence secret. American authorities took the security issue seriously. The fact that Yamamoto had been shot down exactly where predicted was already suspicious. Loose talk could make suspicion certainty. Japan, however, did not immediately respond by eliminating the American intelligence advantage. The secret survived. In strategic terms, that may have been almost as important as the shootdown itself. America had used the intelligence source without completely burning it. Then came the controversy. Who actually destroyed Yamamoto's bomber? For decades, the answer was disputed between Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber. The earliest American accounts created overlapping claims. Lanphier said that during the combat, he engaged a Zero and then attacked the lead bomber. Barber described pursuing and firing into Yamamoto's G4M from behind. Official victory credit was eventually shared, but historians kept returning to the evidence. Japanese accounts raised problems with parts of Lanphier's version. The escorting Japanese fighters apparently did not suffer the loss that Lanphier initially claimed. Physical evidence from the crash site also became important. The pattern of damage to the bomber and testimony about the direction of American fire supported an attack from behind. That aligns strongly with Barber's account. Later historical examination increasingly favored Barber as the pilot who delivered the decisive fire against Yamamoto's aircraft. Yet official administrative credit remained divided. The controversy eventually reached the Secretary of the Air Force and even the federal court system. The official split was not overturned. For documentary purposes, the safest conclusion is therefore precise. Rex Barber unquestionably attacked Yamamoto's bomber from the rear and has a very strong historical case for having delivered the fatal attack. Official U.S. Air Force credit, however, remained shared with Lanphier. That distinction matters because the story is more interesting when the uncertainty is preserved. Combat does not produce perfect camera angles. Pilots maneuver at high speed. Smoke blocks views. Multiple aircraft fire. Seconds become confused. A man can honestly believe he destroyed a target that another pilot also attacked. The paperwork written afterward may turn into official history before every perspective is available. Operation Vengeance was an almost mathematically precise interception, followed by one of the messiest victory credit disputes of the Pacific Air War. To understand why the attack was so destructive, compare the two aircraft. The Mitsubishi G4M was built around range. Japanese planners needed bombers capable of operating across the enormous distances of the Pacific. Range was a strategic weapon. A bomber able to fly hundreds of miles from island bases could threaten ships and airfields far beyond the Japanese defensive perimeter. But aircraft design is compromise. Weight saved in one area can improve performance elsewhere. Early war Japanese aircraft often emphasized range and maneuverability at the expense of protective armor and robust self-sealing fuel systems. The G4M carried large quantities of fuel. That made it capable. It also made battle damage dangerous. American pilots became familiar with the aircraft's tendency to burn when fuel systems were hit. Now placed behind it, a P-38. The Lightning carried concentrated heavy armament in the nose, 4,050 caliber machine guns, a 20mm cannon. The target was not a small, nimble fighter. It was a large twin-engine bomber descending toward the jungle. Once Barber obtained a firing position behind the lead G4M, the engineering decisions of both aircraft collided. Japan had built the Betty to fly far. America had built the Lightning to climb, intercept, and concentrate heavy fire straight ahead. The irony is that Operation Vengeance required the P-38 to become something almost like the G4M before combat. It too had to carry enormous fuel reserves. It too had to prioritize range. But the Americans could discard the external tanks immediately before fighting. The fighter that had spent 2 hours behaving like a long-range cruiser suddenly became a high-performance interceptor. That combination, long-range cruise followed by concentrated firepower, made the P-38 uniquely suited to the mission. The aircraft did not win because it was universally superior to the Zero. A skilled Zero pilot could be extremely dangerous. The Lightning won because the mission was designed around the qualities it possessed: range, speed, firepower, 2 engines, and enough fuel flexibility to reach a target no other available fighter from Guadalcanal could reliably reach. The emotional power of Operation Vengeance comes from the connection to Pearl Harbor. But the deeper historical connection is not revenge. It is information. Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically because Japan achieved surprise. The carrier force crossed the Pacific without being located. American commanders did not know that 6 Japanese carriers were approaching Hawaii. They did not know when the attack would arrive. They did not know the direction of the incoming strike until it was effectively too late. Japan controlled the critical information. The United States reacted. Now move forward 18 months. Yamamoto's flight takes off. Japan believes the itinerary is protected by coded communications. The Americans know the schedule. They know the general route. They know the expected escort. They know enough to position fighters before visual contact. Japan controls the aircraft. America controls the information. The relationship has reversed. Pearl Harbor began with Japanese aircraft appearing where the Americans did not expect them. Operation Vengeance ended with American aircraft appearing where the Japanese did not expect them. Pearl Harbor required Japanese carriers to travel thousands of miles under radio discipline. Operation Vengeance required American fighters to to travel hundreds of miles under radio discipline. Pearl Harbor depended on precise timing between ships and attacking aircraft. Operation Vengeance depended on precise timing between an intelligence prediction and an interception force. Pearl Harbor used secrecy to create surprise. Operation Vengeance used stolen information to create surprise. That is the larger story. The United States did not simply retaliate against the admiral associated with Pearl Harbor. It defeated him using the same fundamental principle that had made Pearl Harbor possible. Know where the enemy will be. Arrive before he expects you. Strike before he can react. Would Yamamoto's survival have changed the outcome of the Pacific War? Almost certainly not by itself. By April 1943, forces much larger than one admiral were shaping the conflict. American shipyards were producing warships at extraordinary rates. Aircraft production was expanding. Pilot training systems were creating replacement aircrews. Japan was losing experienced aviators faster than it could reproduce their skill. The Solomon Islands campaign had consumed Japanese ships and aircraft. Guadalcanal had been evacuated. American and Allied forces were pushing closer to Rabaul. The strategic equation Yamamoto had feared before the war was becoming real. A long conflict increasingly favored the United States. No commander could manufacture fuel. No admiral could instantly replace veteran pilots. No brilliant operation could make a lost carrier reappear. Yamamoto's death, therefore, did not cause Japan's declining position. But it removed an experienced commander during that decline. His successor inherited a war in which Japan was increasingly being forced onto the defensive. There was also psychological damage. Yamamoto represented the prestige of the early Japanese victories. His name was associated with Pearl Harbor. He was respected by sailors. He carried status that could not simply be transferred to another man by issuing orders. The United States understood this when deciding whether to attack him. A commander is part of a military system. Remove him, and the system continues. But it does not necessarily continue unchanged. The loss of Yamamoto forced new command relationships at exactly the moment Japan could least afford disruption. Operation Vengeance also reveals how quickly the United States had changed since 1941. At Pearl Harbor, warning information existed, but was fragmented, incomplete, delayed, or misunderstood. Radar detected the incoming Japanese raid, but the report did not lead to an effective alert. Intelligence indicated increasing danger, but not the operational details needed to stop the strike. Commands were separated. The system failed to transform fragments into action before Japanese aircraft arrived. By April 1943, a very different process was visible. A Japanese message was intercepted. Cryptanalysts worked the code. The information moved upward. Intelligence officers evaluated it. Senior commanders made a decision. Operational planners selected the only fighter with sufficient range. Fuel arrangements were made. Pilots were assigned. Navigation was calculated. Aircraft took off. 16 fighters arrived at almost exactly the location predicted. That is a functioning kill chain. Not perfect, not automatic, but integrated. The remarkable thing about Operation Vengeance is how many different specialties had to work correctly. The radio intercept operator did not shoot Yamamoto. The codebreaker did not fly a P-38. The mechanic did not decide the target. The pilot did not decrypt JN-25. The commander did not install the fuel tanks. Yet remove any one of those links, and the mission may fail. Modern warfare often celebrates the person who pulls the trigger. Operation Vengeance demonstrates that the trigger may be the final 1% of an operation whose outcome was created much earlier. Barber could not shoot what intelligence could not find. Intelligence could not kill what aviation could not reach. Aviation could not reach what fuel planning could not support. And all of them were useless if Mitchell missed the interception point. The Americans had learned to connect information to force. That was becoming one of the defining advantages of the United States in the Pacific. Reduce the story to 4 days. April 14. The Japanese transmit the itinerary. American intercept stations capture it. The message moves into cryptanalytic channels. Analysts begin reconstructing its meaning. The name and schedule become apparent. A possibility emerges. April 15. Intelligence officers evaluate the information. Can Yamamoto be intercepted? Is the source reliable? Will attacking him reveal that the code has been broken? What fighter could reach the area? The P-38 becomes the only practical solution. April 16 and 17. The mission plan becomes increasingly specific. Aircraft, pilots, fuel tanks, course, speed, timing, attack element, cover element, radio silence, cover story. Every hour turns intelligence into an executable operation. April 18. The Lightning's launch. 2 cannot continue normally. 16 press on. For more than 2 hours they fly across the Pacific. No Japanese warning stops Yamamoto. No schedule change saves him. The P-38s reach the Bougainville coast. The Japanese formation appears. Minutes later, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet is dead. 4 days. A radio transmission becomes a corpse in the jungle. That is what made Operation Vengeance unlike an ordinary fighter sweep. The Americans did not hunt until they happened to find Yamamoto. They built a trap around a future location. Of all the numbers in Operation Vengeance, 435 miles may be the most important. Not because every reconstruction gives exactly the same route distance. The indirect mission path was longer than the straight-line separation. But 435 miles captures the fundamental problem. This was far outside the comfortable radius of most fighters operating from Guadalcanal. Imagine being asked to intercept one specific automobile moving between 2 cities, except there are no roads beneath you. Your fuel supply is barely sufficient. You cannot call the target for its position. You cannot use GPS. You cannot orbit indefinitely. You must travel for hours using compass, airspeed, wind estimates, and clock. And when you reach the destination, the target is moving at hundreds of miles per hour. That was Mitchell's problem. The navigation itself deserves to be treated as part of the combat. An error made 1 hour before contact was just as capable of saving Yamamoto as a Zero fighter. If Mitchell had flown the wrong heading long enough, Barber's shooting ability would never matter. If the formation had climbed too early and been detected, Yamamoto might have been warned. If fuel consumption had been greater than expected, the attack might have been abandoned. The mission's dramatic climax lasted minutes. The mission's decisive discipline lasted hours. That is why the Air Force's description of near-split-second timing matters. The P-38s did not merely reach Bougainville. They reached it when Yamamoto did. Distance had been converted into time, and time had been converted into a weapon. Yamamoto understood ships. He understood aircraft. He understood the strategic danger posed by American industry. He understood that Japan could not comfortably fight a long attritional war. But there was one American capability he could not measure from his bomber on April 18. The intelligence picture behind the P-38s. From Yamamoto's perspective, the Pacific between Guadalcanal and Bougainville was protection. Distance was security. Japanese-controlled islands were security. Zero escorts were security. A coded itinerary was security. From the American perspective, those protections had already been bypassed. The code had yielded. The route had been calculated. The range problem had been solved. The Japanese escorts had been incorporated into the attack plan. Yamamoto was therefore flying inside two realities at the same time. In the visible reality, he was a heavily protected admiral traveling through Japanese-held territory. In the invisible reality, he was a moving coordinate. That is the essence of intelligence warfare. The target does not feel vulnerable because the decisive action has not happened yet. But the conditions for destruction may already be in place. 4 days before his aircraft crashed, Yamamoto's future position had begun appearing on American desks. By the time he climbed into the G4M, the trap already existed. All that remained was for both sides to arrive. History often appears inevitable because we know the result. Operation Vengeance was anything but inevitable. Change one variable. Yamamoto leaves late. The bombers encounter weather. Mitchell miscalculates the wind. A P-38 develops engine trouble. The American formation takes longer climbing. The Japanese escort contains more fighters. A coast observer notices the P-38s. The wrong external tank refuses to release. The Japanese bombers alter course. Any of these might be enough. If the Americans arrived 5 minutes early, they would face a decision. Wait? Circle? Climb? Every option increased exposure and fuel consumption. If they arrived 5 minutes late, Yamamoto might already be descending toward Balale. The interception area could become filled with Japanese fighters. The bombers might land. Attacking the airfield would be an entirely different mission, and likely suicidal. The Americans had no second attempt guaranteed. Once Yamamoto knew P-38s had appeared at the end of his itinerary, future travel security would change instantly. Operation Vengeance was therefore a one-shot opportunity. The amazing fact is not that a P-38 could shoot down a G4M. The amazing fact is that the G4M was exactly where the P-38 needed it to be. The name Operation Vengeance makes the emotional motive impossible to ignore. American memory of Pearl Harbor was raw. The attack had happened only 16 months earlier. Thousands had died. Battleships had burned in photographs seen across the country. Yamamoto's connection to the planning of Pearl Harbor made him an obvious symbol. But describing the mission as revenge alone undervalues the men who planned it. Revenge does not calculate fuel consumption. Revenge does not solve an encrypted itinerary. Revenge does not navigate hundreds of miles over open ocean. Emotion may help explain why the target mattered. Professional military execution explains why the mission worked. The Americans did not simply send fighters north because they hated Yamamoto. They evaluated whether killing him was strategically useful. They considered the intelligence risk. They selected a platform based on range. They created a precise interception. And they attempted to conceal how the target had been found. That is not rage. That is targeting. The word vengeance makes the story memorable. The machinery underneath it makes the story historically important. December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft cross hundreds of miles of Pacific. They arrive at a precise time. They achieve surprise. American aircraft sit on the ground. American battleships sit in harbor. The United States does not know where the Japanese carriers are until the attack is already underway. April 18, 1943, American aircraft cross hundreds of miles of Pacific. They arrive at a precise time. They achieve surprise. A Japanese admiral is still airborne. His escort discovers the Americans only when the attack is beginning. Japan does not know how the P-38s found him. Same ocean. Different direction. Different side controlling the information. That is the reversal. Not that America eventually produced a better fighter. Not that one pilot was a better shot. Not that Yamamoto became careless. The decisive change was that the United States had learned how to turn information into action. Japanese communications created a pattern. American cryptanalysts exposed it. American planners turned it into coordinates. The P-38 carried the weapon to those coordinates. And Yamamoto arrived on schedule. After Yamamoto's death, another admiral took command. The combined fleet continued fighting. Japanese aircraft continued attacking. Japanese ships remained dangerous. The war still had more than 2 years to run. Tarawa, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, had not yet happened. Operation Vengeance did not end the war. It did something more specific. It removed one of Japan's most important naval leaders and demonstrated an American capability that would become increasingly decisive. Find, understand, reach, destroy, the P-38 was the visible part. Its twin booms made photographs dramatic. Its concentrated guns finished the mission. But the lightning was the last link in a chain. Somewhere before dawn, a radio operator had listened. Somewhere at Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts had studied groups of numbers. Somewhere in a command office, officers had decided the target was worth the risk. Somewhere on Guadalcanal, mechanics had worked around fighters loaded with enough fuel to cross hundreds of miles of ocean. Major John Mitchell had drawn lines across a chart. Pilots had memorized headings. Clocks had been synchronized. Then 16 P-38s disappeared over the Pacific. For more than 2 hours, nothing proved that the plan would work. Then Bougainville appeared. Then 2 bombers. Then 6 Zeros, exactly where the intelligence said they would be. Rex Barber pushed his Lightning behind the lead G4M. He centered the bomber in front of him. 4,050 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon opened fire. The aircraft carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto fell toward the jungle. The man who had helped plan one of history's most famous surprise attacks died because his enemy had created another one. But the final irony was even sharper. Pearl Harbor had shown Yamamoto how powerful surprise could be when the enemy did not know where you were. Operation Vengeance showed what happened when the enemy knew exactly where you were going to be. The Japanese itinerary had been transmitted 4 days earlier. The Americans had read it. The P-38s had flown hundreds of miles to meet it. And at 9:35 on the morning of April 18, 1943, the appointment was kept. CTA, if you want the Pacific War, told through the decisions, intelligence, machines, and mistakes that actually changed it, not just the famous photographs. Subscribe. Because sometimes the most important battle begins long before anyone pulls the trigger. And in this case, it began with a Japanese radio message that was never supposed to be read.